In this interview, I asked Randy about his journey and research before moving on to some more philosophical questions regarding how this issue can best be resolved. I start out by asking how this all started for him.
My journey actually began when I was in grade school here in Canada. I had actually just moved to Canada the year before. I was actually born in Ireland. And I remember as a young child, we were led down from class into the gymnasium of the school. And we were told that there's this big momentous thing happening. It's historical. Most of us at that age I didn't realize what we were really watching, but I did understand. I understood enough to know that it was a very significant event in history. So we watched Apollo 11 launch that very morning. I was in gymnasium with about 1,000 other kids, and I was somewhere in the middle, and I just remember looking at this little black and white TV at the very front, and nothing compared to what you have today. So for a young child, that was quite a moment to be part of history, even though we didn't fully understand as kids what we were actually watching, but it was still nonetheless a fascinating watch. From that moment on, I was ordering, back then we had these order catalogs. We didn't have internet, of course, and we had these order catalogs, and I was ordering everything that was related to the Apollo missions. I was buying models, the Apollo Command Module, the Lunar Module, the Saturn V rocket, so on and so forth. And I was actually ordering stuff through the mail. I was not only buying models of the Apollo Command Module, I was actually buying paper models that NASA itself, I believe at that time, were selling, or a subsidiary of that agency was selling. So yeah, it had a profound impact on my life for years. I think in part it inspired me to become a pilot, although not fully. There was other reasons why I became a pilot, but that in part motivated me more. So definitely had a very, I would say at that time, positive impact. I don't call it so much a positive impact anymore, but at that time I looked on it as a positive impact. So to be fair, I dove into the JFK assassination in my early 20s, but that in no way altered my view in any sense when it came to the Apollo moon missions. That actually happened quite by accident. I was well into my late 30s when I had that moment where I started to question the Apollo moon missions. It had nothing to do with cynicism. We were all cynical to a point when it came to any government, but not on the level that I am now, of course. But back then, my journey started into the Apollo missions with me still having an element of trust in governments, my own government and governments around the world, some element of trust, not a lot, but it had no bearing on the Apollo missions. I always seem to separate that from the other conspiracies. For example, as I just mentioned, the JFK conspiracy, it just seemed separate because I looked upon that as science, and I was somewhat into physics at that point because I was training to be a pilot, so I was picking up a lot more on that, and I believe in the foundation of physics. That's how we live our lives on a daily basis, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So when it came to the Apollo missions, I never made that connection, even though I was reading and well versed by that time in the JFK assassination conspiracy theories. It had no bearing on my foray into the Apollo moon missions until one moment that dropped one night when I came home from work. I always looked on the Apollo missions as a source of inspiration. I always thought, okay, this is man's greatest achievement in the 20th century. I never really questioned it outside of that. And even though I was aware of some conspiracies and some distrust going on with the government, I never made that connection. Maybe I didn't want to make that connection. I don't know. I mean, I can psychoanalyze myself till the cows come home, and you can come up with many different answers. But it was that one moment, as I said earlier, and that moment happened one night when I had come home from work. I had turned on, back then we had Arts and Entertainment, which back then was a fairly good channel. Now it's just gone crazy, but back then it was a very good channel. They had a lot of good documentaries, and I just happened to switch on Arts and Entertainment on TV, and I was kind of walking back and forth, just unwinding from a long day, and they were talking about, the documentary was on one of the Apollo missions. Now, I wasn't paying too much of attention until one of the astronauts caught my ear when one of the astronauts was talking, and he was making a description like this. So I'll just describe what he was saying, and I'll fill in the rest afterwards. He was describing how On their way back to the moon, they were using the moon as a slingshot for gravity effect. And I knew right away, because I knew a little bit about the Apollo missions at that moment, that time, that they were talking about Apollo 13. Because Apollo 13, according to the official version, the Apollo 13 had an explosion or oxygen tank explosion in a service module, which caused them to have to shut everything down. They were still hooked up, of course, to the lunar module, and they were on their way to the moon at this point. Long story short here, they had to use the moon's gravity as a slingshot. So they're going to swing around the back of the moon and then slingshot towards Earth. That was a way to save power, because at that point they had very limited power resources left because of the explosion. So then they were going to swing around the dark side of the moon and then use the lunar module engine to finish the journey back to Earth. And what stuck out of my mind was when he said, and I believe it was Jim Lovell, if I'm not mistaken, he was instructing the other astronaut, when I fire the engine, no matter what you do, keep the Earth within a grid pattern on the window. Now that's basically what he said, probably not verbatim, but that's, paraphrasing. And that got my attention. I remember I stopped and I looked at the TV and I said to myself, you got to be kidding. You're talking about using visual reference to navigate a crippled spaceship at this point, a very damaged spaceship. You're using visual reference to put yourself back on course 240,000 miles away from Earth. Now, at that time, I used the figure 240,000 miles away. The actual accident or the actual firing of the engine was about 150,000 miles out at that point, but still, nonetheless, I found it very peculiar that they were using visual reference. Now, I know as a pilot, at that time I had a private pilot's license. I had enough experience to know when you're flying navigation and using visual references, how easily you can be lost, how easily you can get off track. And that was the first moment that I thought, wait a minute, that doesn't seem right to me. You would expect something a little bit more sophisticated in their navigational approach. Even with the damage that was done, you would expect something more sophisticated. And that was my moment right there. That was when, okay, something doesn't seem right about that. And that wasn't the moment when I actually thought the Apollo moon missions were faked, but it was certainly what set me on my journey. It was that one specific aspect of the Apollo missions, navigating back to Earth using visual references. That bothered me at that time because I was thinking, wow, I know a little bit of navigation and that's a sure way to get lost. And especially up in space, if you're 0.1 degrees off your track, you could be thousands of miles off your intended course. You could end up being marooned in an elliptical orbit for eternity. I mean, I remember thinking that at that point. So that was my moment. That was the moment that was the turning point for me. For a lot of people who are listening to this, we had no internet when I was growing up. So for me, that was becoming a novelty. So I was learning how to navigate on the internet. And of course, it gave me the opportunity to research many things. And I started researching the Apollo moon missions and just looking more into it. And it wasn't until about 3 or 4 years later, I still couldn't get this thought out of my mind in terms of that A&E documentary on Apollo 13. And I wanted to look further into that. So I used that opportunity to look further into it. And after about 2 or 3 years of researching this, I was like, I don't know what I'm getting on the internet. Am I getting the truth here? Because the internet's kind of like a library. You go into a library, 90% of the books in a library are crap, right? You got to know how to research and sift through for the books you're looking for, the really good ones. And that's kind of the way I sort of approached it with the internet. Okay, I don't know. Anybody can make a video. Anybody can say it's a hoax, and they can give the reasons why. But I need to go deeper into this. And that's when I started ordering books. And I started ordering NASA documents as well as reading the official version. I read many books on the official version, some of which I sourced in both my books, as well as the conspiracy books. Because for me, it wasn't enough just to read the conspiracy books. I had to know what the other side was saying. I had to know what both sides were saying. And that was, for me, the only way I can make a determination that I was satisfied with and that I can go forward with is reading both sides of this. So it took about 5-6 years of bits and pieces until I finally got into some serious research in terms of NASA documents and books and so on and so forth, as well as online information. And that started probably in about 2014 or so, and that led up to my first book. Just because I'm a pilot or commercial pilot doesn't make me an expert on rocket science. And I have been accused of not being a rocket scientist. Well, I never bought into that I have no right to have an opinion because I'm not a physicist skilled specifically in rocketry and so on and so forth. Anybody can research this for themselves and come to their own conclusions. That's exactly what I did. What I will say is being a pilot gave me a little more insight into what to expect. And I was able to use that insight to go deep into the engines of the Saturn V rocket, which launched the Apollo missions to the moon, and specifically focused on the first stage, which was where the F1 engines were. Now, let me explain a little bit about the F1 engines. The F1 engines were actually being developed in the late 1950s by the U.S. military. And when Eisenhower had signed the decree enacting NASA, it was transferred over to Rocketdyne. Rocketdyne was the manufacturer but it was under the supervision. Basically, they were working in tandem with NASA. There was a very interesting character, and everybody knows this character, and he's quite famous. He actually wrote the first book on the Apollo moon missions, being a hoax, and that was Bill Kaysing. Now, Bill Kaysing has been criticized severely over the decades for his book and, the fact that he was basically called a paper pusher. He didn't know what he was doing. He didn't know what he was talking about. But he was actually obviously hired by Rocketdyne for a reason. And if he's hired by Rocketdyne, it means that Rocketdyne felt that he was qualified to read the data output from whatever engines they were developing. And at that time, they were developing the F1 engines. And what he discovered during his 3 or 4 or 5 years, he was there from 1958 to 1963, and what he discovered is that the data output for the F1 engines was being falsified. And he quit in 1963 in disgust at what he had found, because by that time, the F1 engines were being readied for the Apollo missions. Now, the reason why the F1 engines are very important is because the F1 engines were billed, and still are, as the most powerful liquid-fueled rocket ever designed and built and used. Each rocket, each engine puts out 1.5 million pounds of thrust. To put that into perspective, you actually have two Saturn rockets. You have the Saturn 1B and you have the Saturn V. The Saturn 1 uses the H1 engines, and I think they use several engines in their first stage with a combined total of about, and don't quote me on this, but I'm a little bit off on the actual figures, but it's about 1.4 million combined pounds of thrust. When you have the 5 F1 engines in the Saturn V, you're looking at 7.5 million pounds of thrust. And that power was needed to lift the hardware into low Earth orbit in order for it to proceed on its mission to the moon. So they needed that F1 engines to make this work. What I started noticing with the F1 engines is that a lot of data had gone missing. And all of the data pertaining to the F1 engine's performance during and use the Apollo missions were destroyed. Now, I've had people come back and say, well, Randy, it's all documented, it's all on paper, we have it on record, but the actual source of that documentation has been destroyed. And that was, of course, the now infamous telemetry tapes, because all the data from those telemetry tapes recorded everything from the very first moment that rocket launched to the splashdown of the command module a week later in the Pacific Ocean. So I became very suspect about the performance of the F1 engines, and it went deeper from there. If you're using the F1 engines and the F1 engines are not working according to specifications, you have no lunar landing. You cannot get the hardware off the launch pad. You just can't do it. You're talking about 46 tons of hardware. That was a 3,000 ton rocket. Of that, 46 tons was included the command module, service module, lunar module combined. And you needed that amount of power, 7.5 million pounds of thrust, to get that rocket off the launch pad. That's just to get it off the launch pad, to launch it to an altitude of 40 miles. But that launched up to 5,000 miles per hour by the time it reached 40 miles, where the F1 engines were then discarded and jettisoned. So the F1 engines had to work perfectly from that moment of launch to an altitude of, I believe it was 40 miles. If the F1 engines were not working perfectly, you had no lunar landing. That payload wasn't going to get into orbit. In terms of the testing, there were 2 all-man launches of the Saturn V that tested the F1 engines. That was with Apollo 4 and Apollo 6. I always say according to the official version because I've been accused of actually subconsciously endorsing the Apollo missions while you said that they launched. And I said, no, I said according to the official version. So I always put that in. So if people find that annoying, please bear with me, but it's the way I cover myself because a lot of times I'm talking within the framework of the official version. So I will occasionally say according to the official version. So Apollo 4 launched. It was non-man launched, Saturn V, and apparently it worked perfectly. There were no anomalies that were recorded. It was considered a successful flight, but not so with Apollo 6. Apollo 6 was a near disaster. Apollo 5 actually was a Saturn 1B launch, so Apollo 6 was the second Saturn V launch. And it was a near disaster. They had major problems with the F1 engine cooling system. They almost faced an explosion of the first stage, which would have meant the end of the mission anyway. And I remember watching an engineer who had worked on the Apollo mission. He said if there had been a crew on board Apollo 6, they would have had to abort. That's how serious it got. Now, it didn't explode, but it did not reach full power and full capacity. So it was considered a near disaster. So it was actually considered a failure. They had made some modifications to the F1 engines, and they decided, well, they need to launch it again. But this time they launched it, and this is an important point, they launched it 7 months later under the Apollo 8 mission, which is the third Saturn V launch using the F1 engines, but this time with a crew. And I'm wondering if the listener just picked up on something here, because they just said that they modified those engines to rectify the problems that they were having with those engines, but there was no testing in between. They just went straight from a near disaster to a launch with a crew 7-8 months later. That is a major problem for me. That is a major red flag. There was no static testing done. There was absolutely no further testing done of those engines to make sure that they weren't having the same problems that they were having with Apollo 6. They went straight from Apollo 6, a near disaster on that mission, to 7 months later to another Saturn V launch, only this time it was manned. No testing. Now, if people don't find that a little peculiar, then maybe they'll find this a little peculiar, because I want to read something. It's just a small paragraph regarding what I was just talking about. And then I want to go back to Bill Casing. This was written by an author. He does a series of American Space series, and he did a series on the Saturn rocket. And he has one here called the Saturn Rocket 5, America's Rocket to the Moon. And his name is Eugene Reichel, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly. And he also works with the European Aeronautic Defense and Space Company. And here's what he wrote about what I just described. The problems they were having with the F1 engines is specific to the combustion chamber. Quote, the spontaneous combustion instabilities never reappeared. Until the end, however, the problem was never completely understood. To this day, it remains a constant problem in large rocket engines for which an individual empirical solution has to be found. To the disappointment of the engineers, a model was never found with which they could generally overcome the problem. Unquote. That to me is a loaded statement. They're actually telling everybody that they had a major problem with the F1 engines. They fixed the problem with the F1 engines, but they never found out what the problem with the F1 engines was. It's an amazing statement for anyone to make, and anyone connected to the space agency. It's an amazing statement to make. The F1 engines gets a little bit technical. But basically what was happening is you have several components for the F1 engines. You have the engine components on top. Next, there's a fuel injector. And below the fuel injector, you have the combustion chamber. And below that, you have the throat area. And below that, you have the nozzle, which everybody sees when rockets are lifting off. The problem was with the combustion chamber of the F1 engines. What was happening is the cooling system was breaking down. So the way this works is 70% of the propellant, when it went through the injector, 70% would go through these hundreds of tubes that were on the outside of the combustion chamber, while 30% went directly into the combustion chamber itself. And the reason for sending fuel or propellant through the hundreds of tubes on the outside of the combustion chamber was to absorb the thermal energy from the explosion. You had to keep this engine cool. You're reaching temperatures of 5,000 to 6,000 degrees Fahrenheit. So if you couldn't find a way to stabilize those temperatures, you're going to have a distortion of the combustion chamber, and it's going to lead to an explosion and the loss of the rocket. That's what was happening with the unmanned launch of Apollo 6, the second unmanned launch of the Saturn V. So there was a lot of instability within the combustion chamber of the F1 engines. And as I said before, without the F1 engines, you have no moon landing.
What I generally hear from people who are cynical of the landings is that they believe that NASA sent probes up and photographed the moon, and they believe that the Russians have sent probes up and photographed the moon, and that's all real. It's the landing and the return that people are typically cynical of. And part of the reason they believe in the probes is because they need the photographs to be able to then fake the moon landings here on Earth. If there's a fundamental problem with the rocketry, would that affect even NASA's ability to send a probe up around the moon? Or indeed, well, the Russians are using different rockets, but the Russians, one thing I learned in your book, that it's something I feel I should have known this, this should be a commonly known fact, but the Russians actually got a tortoise to orbit the moon. That was the first creature to, and I can't believe that that's not something I knew. That sounds like something everyone should know. But what's your opinion on just the unmanned probes that go up to the moon in that case?
Yeah, well, see, the difference is that the unmanned probes are using far less power. So you're not using an F1 engine. So I just want to emphasize one more time, that the F1 engines were specific to the Apollo moon landings, not anything outside of that. Like, for example, Apollo 7 was the Saturn 1B launch. That was the first Apollo mission to orbit the Earth. And they used the H1 engines, not the F1 engines. The H1 engines produce a total of, I think it's about slightly over 200,000 pounds of thrust. So you're not facing the same amount of problems that you're facing with the much larger, much powerful F1 engines. You see, the Apollo 7 didn't have a lunar module on board. That was a low Earth orbit mission. So if I was to actually go with one of the missions that actually worked, I would probably reluctantly go with Apollo 7, but not the rest outside of that, because they were using the F1 engines. So in answer to your question is they were using far less powerful engines that have been actually in service for quite a few years, launching unmanned probes. So it's very easy to launch an unmanned probe. They have the technology to do that. And they have the technology to send those unmanned probes to the moon, even to Mars. They seem to have a lot of problems, but they seem to have some technical prowess when it comes to doing that, when it comes to unmanned missions. When you value something, when you felt inspired by an event in history, and then along comes Randy Walsh and says, no, it was a hoax. I mean, I understand it. It's going to upset some people out there. So I've always prepared for that. And I understand. I understand it. I don't take it personally. At first I did. That's natural. It's human nature. But I've learned not to take it personally anymore. And I understand there's some emotions out there that, it's fair. It's fair for people to say, hey, Randy, you're full of it. You don't know what you're talking about. You're not a rocket scientist. I get it. I understand that. My response to them is that I'm not telling you what to think. I'm not telling you what to believe. All I'm asking you to do is do the research I did. Maybe you'll come to a different conclusion, and maybe you'll come to the conclusion I did. But all I'm asking you to do is do your research.
Do you ever find any productive interactions with people who are on the other side of the fence, in terms of, do you feel that you've received criticism that's valid and have you adjusted your work accordingly, or does that not exist really?
No, that does exist. With some individuals, I have had some interaction back and forth with maybe one or two. I would say maybe about 10-15% of people who disagree with me have been very civilized and want to talk about it. The others have been very borderline abusive and threatening. That seems to go with the territory. Like I said, I don't respond to them anymore. I've blocked them. I've got better things to do in my day to sit here and argue with people. I'm not out to change anybody's minds. I believe what I believe. And it's up to the reader to read my books or not read my books. That's up to them. But just research NASA. Go to NASA's website. Start looking at the documents. Start reading the books that actually support the Apollo missions. Stay away from the conspiracy books. Just read that alone, and you might come to a different conclusion. That's all I'm suggesting.
Okay, Randy, so I only really became interested in this beyond a kind of casual interest that everyone maybe has and maybe watches a documentary or two, just a few months ago when David Chandler and Don Davies published this article. And I don't know Don Davies, but I do know David Chandler. I've interviewed him on his work on 9/11, and they published this article with these three, what they saw as knockout punches to dismiss the moon landing hoax. I kind of took objections. I don't want to in a sort of personal sense, but just in the feel like, I don't think it's very well argued. Okay, I don't think that would be the way to go about it, to predetermine what three cases are going to be the knockout punches. And I don't think they were really knockout punches. So this kind of got me interested really in the question of taking a step back from the question of, well, did we go to the moon or not, to, well, hang on, If we wanted to uncover that, how would we go about it? What questions should we be asking? Is it even possible for the average person who's not going to devote years of their life to rocketry or analysis of photographs or the geology of moon rocks to even come to a conclusion on that? And it seems to me that irrespective of whether men set foot on the moon or not, as we pass the 50th anniversary of no return trips, the number of people who are cynical of that is just going to go up and up and up.
My first inclination is to fire back a question and ask, whose fault is this? I don't blame people for either being cynical or for being angry. I don't blame average people for this. This stops at the very doorstep of the power elite. They're the ones that created this. They're the ones that created this in the last several decades. Not you, not me, not my next door neighbor, the power elites. We saw evidence of this, abundantly clear evidence of this in the last 3 years. How we've been manipulated, attempts at mind control, threatened by the very people we put in office to represent us. The world was never like this. Governments are not there to control us. Governments are there to work for us. It's up to us to decide. And that means if governments come up and say, man, oh, they landed on the moon, okay, show me. Show me the proof. I read the books. I read the documents, NASA. In my opinion, I will say, okay, it's my opinion. For people who want to get upset with me, it's my opinion. There's no conclusion. There is no evidence. Either way, major conspiracies happen in the 20th century, and there's a reason for that. Governments lie, and they even admit they lie years later. How many times have we heard of Area 51? And how many times has the CIA and the government come out and say, Area 51 doesn't exist? You're delusional. It doesn't exist. And what happened 20 years ago? They finally come out and said, it exists. Area 51 exists. Now, is it because of alien spacecraft? No, I don't think so. I think it's just high-tech experimental U.S. military aircraft that was being tested there. But the fact is we knew it existed. We knew it existed decades before the CIA finally admitted it. And why is it that we always seem to know, us crackpots, I can put it that way, parentheses at it, we come out and say it didn't exist, only to come out 20 or 30 years later that it did happen, right? So the onus is, as much and all as I fault governments, I also kind of have to put a little bit of blame on people. You have to stop believing in higher authority and governments and start believing in yourselves. What are your instincts telling you? Do what they tell you. Look into this for yourselves. There's no easy answer to this, Richard. Absolutely no easy answer. I'm willing to put the work in. I've researched the Apollo missions. I spent many years researching it. I'm still researching it. I'm going to be writing more books about it. And I am convinced, based on the research that I have done, that the Apollo moon missions were faked. Now, you can ask me the reason why. I can come up with several different reasons. But the bottom line is, start with the facts. The fact is, as far as I'm concerned, is they were faked. I did that. I based that on the research that I've done. Not a YouTube video, not the internet. In part, I did use that as a source. But 90% of the sources of my books, and I've listed those sources, come from NASA's own information. The only thing I can say to people is that you have to put faith in yourselves, to research this for yourselves. If somebody tells you something, black as white, find out for yourself. Can you pick one aspect of society or technology in the last 200 years that was brought out to the benefit of society and then just stopped? There was never any further progression. Most advances in technology happen organically for society. And you could pick anything in the last 200 years, and it just takes on a life of its own. But not so with the Apollo moon missions. Back in 1972, if somebody had said, oh, it's not going to happen for another 50 years, you would have been laughed at. But instead, what we get is that we're going back in 10 years, or no, we're going back in 15 years. Oh, but when that 15 years comes, then they said, no, actually, we're going back in 10 years. And that 10 years comes, and so on and so forth. It's actually become a Monty Python skit, in my opinion. The last 50 years, the whole Apollo moon mission program has become, for me, a Monty Python skit. I mean, things happen to you, you're just not looking, you're not paying attention, you're in denial, I don't know what you want to call it, but manned space missions would be the next step for mankind. I mean, it would be the next step for us to explore the cosmos, if I can put it that way. And there was an opportunity, as you said earlier, for NASA and the U.S. military to expand on that, to expand on what they had achieved back in 1972. Nothing has been done. We're half a century later, and still nothing has been done. What was it, 4 years ago, Trump, as far as I'm concerned, laid down the gauntlet, and he told NASA, you did it once, do it again. and it'll give you to 2024, and we're on the doorstep of 2024, and are nowhere near preparing for a launch. How long is this going to continue before people realize that there's something seriously wrong here? Wrong here.